Alright, so in your most recent assignment, you were learning about ISO, which is all about how sensitive your camera is to light. In your next assignment, you'll be learning about aperture, which is how much light you are letting in through your lens into your camera. So the aperture is an opening in your camera that can expand or contract. It can be larger or smaller. A wider opening means you're letting in more light, and a narrower opening means you're letting in less light. So you would adjust this based on where you are. If you're in a really bright environment, you might want to narrow down that aperture. And if you're in a really dark environment, you might want to widen that aperture. This might be a little bit familiar because your body also has apertures, 2 of them, in your eyes. Your irises are doing the same thing that the aperture on a lens does. They get smaller in really bright conditions and they get larger in really dark conditions. So how do you label aperture size? Is it just like small, medium, large? No. So the way that aperture size is labeled is with the letter F and then a number after it. Usually that number is somewhere between 1 and 22. And this is called the f-stop. And here's the only confusing thing about f-stop. A smaller number, like a smaller f-stop, like f2, for example, is a larger opening. It's a wider opening in the aperture. And a larger number, like f22, is a smaller aperture. If you want to know why this is, well, there's some geometry and some history of photography. Basically, camera companies wanted to have a universal, unified measurement for aperture that could be the same across all cameras. That's kind of what they came up with. It's not important to know that right now. All you need to know is smaller f-stop, smaller number, is a larger aperture, and a larger f-stop, larger number, is a smaller aperture. So if you've got a later model iPhone that has portrait mode, you might have actually seen these f-stop numbers before. This might be somewhat familiar because in portrait mode, you can control the background blur. You can either increase it or decrease it with a dial in the app. And that dial has these f-stop numbers built into it. And what you might notice is that f2 on that dial is a more blurred background, and maybe 22, I don't know how high it goes, is a less blurred background. So first of all, this is artificial. The iPhone actually doesn't have an aperture that you can adjust. It's a fixed aperture. You can't make that adjustment. And even if you could, that's not an adjustment you'd be able to make after you took the image. That's an adjustment you would make before you take the image. But it does illustrate something really useful. When that f-stop is a smaller number, meaning when that aperture is wider, less of the image is going to be in focus. That's how you would get it so that only someone's face is going to be in focus, but nothing in front of them and nothing behind them is going to be in focus. It's called depth of field, and you get a narrower depth of field. That is, less stuff is in focus when you've got a wide open aperture. When you have a narrower aperture, you have more depth of field. So the thing right in front of the camera will be in focus and the mountains miles away will be in focus when you have a really narrow aperture. This depth of field with some background blur and foreground blur and that sort of thing is really appealing, and lots of photographers love it. I love it. But using a wider open aperture can also make achieving focus a little bit more difficult. It can make it a little bit more difficult to actually get pictures in focus. So it's easier to focus with an aperture like f8. Again, your eyes do the same thing. You might have noticed if you ever are trying to read in a dark room and there's not very much light, it's kind of hard to focus. Well, that's because the apertures in your eyes are wide open, and it's more difficult to focus when they're wide open. Turning on a light helps because it allows you to narrow down those apertures in your eyes, makes it easier to focus. All right, so for the next assignment, you'll be setting both the ISO and the aperture yourself. So let's talk about the relationship between these 2 settings a little bit. Remember that picture from our last video of that really grainy image? Remember that I took that picture at a really high ISO, which is why it had so much of that grain, that digital noise. Well, let's take a look at that picture and look at some other settings and look at the aperture. The f-stop on this picture is f22. That's a really narrow aperture. I'm not letting in very much light into my camera. And to compensate for that, in order to make an image that's not going to be completely black, I have to crank up that ISO really high, and that leads to that digital noise. But in the improved image, I did 2 things. I opened up that aperture, so I let in more light, and that allowed me to bring down the ISO to a more reasonable number. So in this next assignment, you'll be getting some hands-on experience with that relationship between the 2 settings. Now, for those of you who are doing this on your phones with the 645 app, unfortunately, the app does not allow you to control the aperture on your camera phone. In fact, no camera phone allows you to adjust the aperture. They all have fixed apertures, so it's just not something that's going to be available for you. You'll have to go without for this assignment, basically doing the assignment kind of the same way you did the last assignment, just adjusting the ISO. So again, to set the aperture on this camera, I hold down this button right here where it says AV, that stands for aperture value, has a little plus minus there. Press that button and then hold it and then turn this dial here, the same dial that you use to adjust your shutter speed. That's how I set the aperture on this camera. It might be different on your camera. Some cameras have a wheel back here that you can use, or a wheel up here by your thumb that you can use, and some you'll have to go into the menu here and find the aperture value there. Again, this is a good reason to have the manual for your camera handy. You can also look up tutorials for a lot of these things on Google or YouTube. So again, for this assignment, make sure you go in and format your SD card. Set your shutter speed at 100. Then you can set your aperture wherever you want, whatever's appropriate for your photo. And you can set your ISO by hitting that button and setting your ISO wherever you want. One tip, you probably want that ISO to be as low as possible, right, to minimize that digital noise. So try starting with the lowest possible ISO, and then see if you can open up your aperture wide enough to get enough light to make an image. It might be the case that if you're photographing indoors at night or in kind of a dark condition, that when you bring your ISO all the way down to 100, the lowest it goes, and then you open up your aperture as wide as it goes, it's still not enough. You're still going to get a dark image. In that sort of situation, that's where you would need to increase that ISO. And you want to increase it just enough that you're getting a properly exposed image and not so much that you're getting into digital noise territory. Once again, I recommend that you do your shooting outdoors during the day. It's just going to make your life a little bit easier. And try a variety of ISOs and apertures. In the next video, I'll be explaining exactly what kinds of pictures you're going to be taking for this assignment as we are learning aperture and ISO.